Let's dive right in just like yesterday. There are basically three main points to this talk that I want to cover. I want to try and reduce the shame and stigma around burnout. When I interview people, they say they don't generally want to talk about it for obvious reasons. It's painful, it's embarrassing. They're worried that it may impact their career or their consulting business. I want to share the knowledge that I've gained from other people, from reading research, and from doing some of my own research. And I want to share strategies for managing burnout. It's important at this point to note that I am not a medical professional or a doctor. I am a cook who dropped out of cooking school. So take what I say with a grain of salt, and this talk can't be a substitute for professional medical care. What is this talk built from? Well, it's built from reading a lot of research on burnout. Much of the research on burnout has been done on medical professionals, people in the helping professions that have a shockingly high rate of burnout. In the US, a recent survey indicated that over 50%, just over 50%, of working physicians had experienced some moderate to severe form of burnout, I think in the previous decade. It's also built on things like a survey that I conducted that's been answered by, when I last looked, when these charts that you'll see in a moment are generated from, about 107 people answered. I had a therapist that I know who specializes in burnout review the slides, or review the content, and of course it's based on my own experience with burnout. I'll put it up again at the end, but there will be a link, or there is a link, to various resources that I will continue populating as time moves forward. So what is burnout? There are many different definitions. Most of them center around work as the primary cause. So this is the World Health Organization's definition for occupational burnout, as published in their International Catalog of Diseases in 2019. And it highlights that it's about chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed, and it says that it's characterized by feelings of depletion or exhaustion, cynicism, and reduced efficiency, or efficacy. And that's pretty common to burnout in most professions, it seems, and most people. There are some things I think that are a little different about burnout in FLOSS. There are also many, 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 many models of burnout, and they're very interesting. They range from what I would say are insightful, like the Freudenberger's 12-phase model of burnout that pretty accurately describes the steps that people go through, to things like in the middle of this model that talks about what neurochemicals are released as you undergo which different phases. These models end up being very complex and very hard to apply, I think, for most people who are experiencing burnout. The last thing you need is another complex model to try and follow to manage a difficult situation. And I have a very simple model that I think is effective. I think that burnout is fundamentally about two things and how you balance them: stress, and stress can be many things. It can literally be stress, a stressful experience, something that frightens you, upsets you, and so on. But it's also the things that we do that help build us up, like study, work our jobs. Exercise is a form of stress. And stress has to be balanced by rest. These two things have to be in balance or else you don't have function. If you rest all the time, you lose function, even though you're resting. If you are stressed all the time, you lose function because you don't ever recharge. What you need is a cycle between these two things, and the cycle needs to maintain some kind of reasonably healthy balance, a constructive balance, over time. And ideally, as you go through these cycles of doing something and then doing something restorative, you build yourself up. And the pattern that tends to happen in burnout is you spend resources you don't have. You draw on your reserves. As Rumi puts it, you let the well run dry, and you end up finding yourself in burnout. This simple model, I think, is quite effective because you can check in with yourself at regular intervals, daily intervals, every few hours, and probably get a good sense of, do you need to actually stop and recharge? I think many of us who fall into burnout are out of touch with that sense of whether or not we need to recharge, or we believe that we don't need to recharge. I think that a good model is something like brushing your teeth. We all know that the ideal practice is something like twice a day for 2 minutes a day. And you don't want to brush too hard, and you don't want to brush too soft. Over the course of a year, that's approximately 24 hours. You can't do that all in one go before you head off to see the dentist. If you were to brush your teeth for 24 hours straight, you would, of course, have roughly no gums left if you managed to accomplish the task. I think that self-care and self-management are a lot like this. For them to be effective, you have to have them in a cycle that balances your stresses. For brushing your teeth, as an example, even the brushing of your teeth is a stress. The reason that the recommendation is twice a day for 2 minutes is because if you brush too much, your gums don't have time to recover from the cleaning, and they slowly degrade over time. It's very much about finding that healthy balance. And here's an interesting result from the survey. When faced with this statement, I plan to take better care of myself once I'm less busy, here's how people responded. We have a lot of people who say that often or usually, roughly a third of them, plan to take better care of themselves once they're less busy. And I think for the majority of people, that's usually true. We plan to do better, we plan to jog in the morning or do yoga or meditate or whatever it is, but often life is complicated and there's always something that's in the way. And I think that's perfectly natural. Our lives end up being highly structured, even if they don't seem like it. There are usually forces that keep us moving through the same patterns over and over again, and those are difficult to manage. It's not one cycle of stress and rest that you have to manage. It's your children, your parents, your family members, everything, your projects that you manage. All of these things have different stress cycles that you have to try and recover from, which makes it really complicated. I said I would talk about my own experience. And for me, that was a cycle of burnout that led to what I called a mental breakdown in 2004, because I didn't know what else to call it. And I think the cycle of burnout happened for some fairly typical reasons. I was a very hyperactive kid. I did poorly in school. I dropped out of high school, and then I dropped out of cooking school. And I wasn't really sure what to do with my life. I just kind of wandered from job to job. And all of that ended up changing in 2004, when my mother went to a business development course, and a programmer there told her about the information superhighway. And as someone who apprenticed at a newspaper who still used manual layup of type, who had a very physical experience of the printing process, to her, the idea that you could publish anywhere on the network instantly was amazing, and she knew that it would change everything. So she dropped all of her plans and started working on an internet startup as a writer with no technical skills. She convinced my brother and I to join her. He would sell whatever it was that we could sell, and because I had played a lot of Lode Runner and other games on a friend's computer, I was going to learn the necessary computer things. So I dove in. We went out, we bought a computer, and I started learning HTML. And I learned it mostly by cut and paste, and from an old HTML+ reference that I had. Not that it was that old at the time. Over time, I found that as we took on more demanding projects, HTML alone wasn't up to the task. I did one project consisting of 2 consecutive all-nighters in a row, where I made some, 42 to like 2,000 and some odd pages of HTML using a search and replace tool. And at the end, I thought there has to be a better way. And as it happened, my internet service provider, an old Unix hacker, had told me there was a better way, and it was called PHP-FI, and I should really take the time to learn it. So I started learning it, but I had no background in computing or programming. I'd written a little bit of BASIC, so I had to learn on the online forums. And I found myself in the PHP forums reading very much and feeling this debt building up from all these people who were helping me when I had questions. And so I started contributing. And I was working on the family business. I was working a second job to pay the bills because the family business wasn't paying the bills at the time. And I was spending a lot of time on the forums. And I was really tired most of the time, but I was still in my 20s and I could actually still pull all-nighters at that point in time. And I think that's where it really started. The matches started to burn. And I would always go through a cycle of overcommitting because I wanted to help, under-delivering because I would procrastinate or just have too much on the go, being late, pulling all-nighters, over-delivering where possible, sometimes still under-delivering horribly. being mostly non-functional for a few days or a week, playing video games compulsively the entire time, and fantasizing about running away or getting hit by a bus. But I kept doing it because, on one hand, things were so awesome. I kept working on the PHP community project, and I ended up running the PHP quality assurance team, and that was great. And then I got invited to work on some books, and that was great. And then I was working on a book, and the main authors dropped out, and I was able to take over, and that was great. It was so great that I had to quit my job to finish the project because I was so far in over my head. But I published a book, and then I got to rub it in the face of my English teacher who had caused me problems in high school, and I thought everything was fantastic. And once again, I ended up burning out and finding myself in a place where I wished that my life was over. But it was still great because the book meant that I got a job at MySQL in 2001 or so, and that was great because MySQL was such an exciting new startup, and we were doing open source and free software, and everyone wanted to hear me when I went places to talk because I was doing community advocacy for them. I had fantastic hair at the time. And I did everything. I worked remotely, I traveled half the year, I got to see exciting places like the Frankfurt train station more than I wanted, which is why I shouldn't have been late because I know who Deutsche Bahn is. I traveled and I traveled and I worked and I worked and I was remote, and all of my colleagues were usually 9 hours away, and my manager was never available, and then he got replaced with someone else, and things went really, really, really sideways. And I burned out, I would say, traumatically. I burned out so that I found myself in a hotel in Frankfurt, and I couldn't talk for most of a day. And I don't really remember how I got home. I don't really remember anything from the few months that followed. I came away with a lot of debt, about 2 years of my wages in debt. I hadn't paid my taxes. I hadn't filed my expense reports. I had a 10 grand credit card bill that I had defaulted on. I tried to resign. I wasn't allowed to resign. I was just let go, and because I was consultant, I had nothing to fall back on, and it was really bad. And I thought, well, maybe I should kill myself at this point. That might be the best thing. I also had people who depended on me, who I couldn't support. And I did recover. I did manage to have some friends figure out what was going on and drag me out of where I was. And I found my way to food camp, and I found another job, and I moved cities, and I ended up talking to people about it, and talking to people about it was clearly the best thing to do. And I found something interesting. A lot of other people in this space had burned out, and after I was about a year or two away from my own burnout, I could help them. So I did. It became something I do at conferences, talk to people who look like they're burning out. Because, well, when you see someone in person, often you can tell if they're not really taking care of themselves. If you ask them, how are you? And immediately you see some tears well up. If at this point in the talk you think, wow, that sounds like my life, well, you shouldn't do what I did. I didn't talk to anyone immediately. I didn't get professional help. I did drop things, but only because I couldn't possibly pick them up. I couldn't possibly continue. Here's what I'd recommend you do if it is this bad. Step 1, get help. You may become completely non-functional, and you want people you can trust to help you out. Ideally, this should be someone who's a professional who specializes in burnout. And there are more and more of them, and they can be really good. And you should reach out to people you trust. They will carry you along, hopefully, when you can't carry yourself. From my own pathology, I found that I could not rest, even if I were in bed, I could not rest until I had the feeling I had done enough. The funny thing was, is I might get to a computer and play video games while feeling I had to do more, but that's how things go. But the thing I found that works is step 2, after you ask for help, is put down what you can. Don't do a lot of it. Don't go manic, as I did at times, and try to put everything down and fix everything all at once. That's not a good strategy either. But instead, take a few things that you need to responsibly put down, where no one's going to die if you stop doing it, and put them down. Resign from that committee. Step away from that project for a few months. If you can't quite do it on your own, get one of these people who's helping you to sit down for an hour and identify things you can put down. And then, damn it, rest. Rest as best you can. You need to recharge. And these are things like a vacation if you can afford it. Getting someone to help take care of your kids if you've got someone you trust. Getting physical activity, and not working out, for God's sake, unless that's something you like to do and it's good, but go for a walk. Get something that gets you out of the environment that keeps you burned out. And maybe look at your own healthcare. At one point, I walked around with a crown that had fallen off in my mouth for 2 years because I had other things to do. And having worked in a dental lab, I understood this is a terribly stupid thing to do. Also painful, I can mention. So after I burned out, I'll give the short version of what happened. I did it again and again and again, but I kept learning better and better coping strategies, ways to put out the fire before it got too bad. And then something interesting happened in 2010. So I was then in my mid-30s. I had spent most of my time in free software and open source communities, and I found myself spending time in Vancouver's queer community, as they call themselves. And in this particular segment of Vancouver's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, etc. community, they had something really interesting that I had never seen before. They had group norms and best practices around how you take care of yourself and how you take care of other people in your community, around active interdependence. And this is the damnedest thing. Getting into a community where people actually have a language to talk about what self-care looks like, they have routines that they can share, and this idea of active interdependence where there's an expectation you take care of yourself because there's also an expectation that you take care of others. If you don't take care of yourself as best you can, others need to take care of you, and that's a burden on them. But when you can't take care of yourself, others will pick you up. And that's something I would love to see in our free software and open source community. They have skills for these things in the same way that we have best practices for code, best practices for submitting pull requests, et cetera, et cetera. And it's amazing. It makes a community that is a hell of a lot poorer monetarily than our community be a lot better at supporting people. I'm amazed at how much money they could scrape up at a moment's notice when someone really needed it. Things that I don't see happening in the free software and open source community, even though we have so much more money. There are other things that changed, but because I've repeated the experience from yesterday, I won't cover them. So why do we burn out? Why do free software, open source, open culture people tend to burn out? And I think it's the same story as everyone else. It is chronic unmanaged stress. It's not enough self-care. That's no wonder. But I think the thing that really makes a difference to us and to anyone who's burning out in the context of a community is that in free software and open source, for most of us, it is about identity. It's not just that we're doing some work that matters. It's usually that we're doing work that matters. Maybe we even feel that it's going to save the world or help save society. And we are a part of that group. And doing that work is fundamental to our identity. Of those 107 people that I surveyed, at the point when I generated this chart, almost 50 of us chose the strongest possible response to the statement, my participation in FLOSS projects is an important part of who I am. And in the interviews with people, this came up over and over again. Even people who chose the second strongest degree, together they make up over 80%. It is a super strong norm for us. I heard a lot of things like, I would quit the project, but there are too many people relying on me. Or, what's a few hours of sleep compared to saving the world? I think often in open source and free software, we have anti-patterns for self-care. We talk about things like someone's larval phase, where they become a real hacker. And yes, I went through a larval phase, and it was great, but you know, I probably would have learned more if I had had more sleep. That was one of the things that did really change around 2010. I went from 4 or 5 hours of sleep a night to working my way up to getting 7 to 9 hours of sleep a night. And I tell you, I was a different person because I had more resources to cope with unexpected stress. I think another key thing is often when we participate in these communities that we really deeply care about, we do it remotely. We only meet a few times a year typically. And that makes it hard for anyone else to actually take care of you. You have to take some effort to say in text, if you're using chat, or to not pretend if you're using video chat, that something's wrong. Whereas if you're working with someone in person, you can usually see when their self-care starts to decline, when they don't look nearly as well-groomed as they did, say, a year ago. One funny quote from this in the survey was, it's going to happen, as in burnout's going to happen, but too bad as you won't succeed otherwise. They're partially right, I think. I think that's true. You have to invest some time, but looking back at the time I invested busting my ass on projects, I could have gotten the same results and probably made fewer mistakes if I had had more rest. I just kept going because I felt it was virtuous to do, because people approved of it, because I was always available and always engaged. And I would have done better, I think, if I hadn't been so available. I think another factor here is that people often don't get as much support in their personal life because there is a conflict between their FLOSS participation and the rest of their life. I think if the people in your life resent how much time you spend at the computer and feel ignored, they probably aren't as able to support you as they might be otherwise. I think another thing that's not always covered in the literature on burnout that is tremendously important is that burnout is intersectional. It's combinatorial. It is not just your work stresses and your project stresses. It is everything in your life brought together. It is who you are. It is your family obligations. It is your family of upbringing and how you were raised. It is the norms of the groups you participate in. It is the health of your finances. It is the state of the country that you live in. It is how your brain works. It's all these things put together and how they intersect. I think this is one reason why burnout often looks like cascading failure in networks. It's a consequence of a life being very busy, not having any space for failure, and then something fails. And if it's important, you try to fix it. And when you try to fix it, you have to let something else go. But usually, something less important, but still important, once neglected, fails. And then you have to try and fix it because it's become more important. A tiny, small problem, because you had no capacity to fix it quickly, topples something else and something else and something else. And for reference, these dominoes are the size needed, the minimum size needed for a small domino to topple a bigger one. And you see, it just takes a few failures to get to a very large domino at the end. I think the math was something like 21 dominoes could topple the Empire State Building if they followed this pattern of growth. And I think the other interesting thing about burnout or anti-burnout is that while failure is exciting and happens quickly, success tends to happen slowly. It's incremental growth. And it's being consistent in the face of setbacks. And that's really hard, I know, for myself at least. If I've been doing well on my self-care routines and I fall off them, when I get back on that horse, I may try to do everything all at once. And that usually is actually more stress than I can handle, and then I fall off the wagon again. And usually those cycles get smaller and smaller. But it's important to get back on perhaps more gently than you fell off. So what are some ways to manage and practice self-care around burnout? I think there are 4 big things. Self-awareness, so you recognize what leads you to burnout and when you're not taking enough care of yourself. Self-care practices, so you have ways to rest and restore to balance the stress. Structure, because our lives are busy, and usually they're so structured that we will keep doing the things that harm us if we don't change something about how they are constructed. And lastly, support from other people, because even structural changes are often not enough. You need help from others to successfully change how you act. So for the introspection and self-awareness pieces, I think there are a few critical things. Journaling, which is a lot like logs on your servers. Write down how you're doing regularly. It doesn't need to be pretty. All it needs to do is reflect a state so that you can look back at it in a day or two, a month or two, a week or two, and figure out what may have happened that caused you to not function as well as you would like. Practice meditation that involves awareness, especially the ones that help you understand what's happening in the moment, help you observe your state somewhat dispassionately. Talk to friends, get a coach, someone who can spot you, someone who can keep a somewhat objective eye. If someone checks in on you in every couple of weeks and asks you how you're doing, all they get is the snapshot of how things are at a point in time. And if you're accurate with them, if you're honest with them, often they can see what seems like a sped up version of your life, and they can probably help you realize if you're headed up or if you're headed a bit down. There's also this brilliant thing, commissioned in part by the Dalai Lama of all people. It's Ekman's Atlas of Emotions, and it includes this brilliant process for debugging your reactions to things. It's very similar to the nonviolent communication process, and If you're at all of a sort who likes to apply process to problems, this particular process helps you look at what happens in your life, understand why you react a certain way, and make different choices, mindful choices. My default is to say yes to most things when it involves a community project. I'll do it. I will step right up. And I've learned actually it's better that I don't and I wait 24 hours. And if I remember the opportunity in 24 hours and I think I have time to do it, maybe I'll step up then. And it's this kind of process. I use the nonviolent communication process, which is more irritating and a little simpler. This is more precise, if a tiny bit more complex. Support. Support is incredibly important, and that's support in your workplace. People who have support from their managers, who trust their managers, do so much better compared to those who don't. So even if your boss is busy, your project lead is busy, if you trust them, approach them and ask them for help if you need help. A lot of workplaces will make accommodations. Get a therapist. I grew up hating therapists due to some bad experiences, but as an adult going to therapy and knowing what I wanted, a therapist was great, was extremely helpful. And they have the advantage of, if they're a good therapist, they are only there to do their job. They don't have the conflicts of interest that friends and family may have, who may love you dearly, but they also need things from you, and that can be complicated. Talk to your friends. Self-care. I love this quote from Rumi. I usually find Rumi a little impenetrable, but this really sings to me. Never give from the depths of your well, but from your overflow. And the basic message here is, don't spend resources you don't have. Instead, learn ways to cultivate the overflow of your well so that you can give more. And these are things like get enough sleep, go for a walk, get light activity. A little bit of activity regularly is way better than the occasional trip to the gym. It's about consistency. And there are so many great studies on how beneficial and important just walking is. Have boundaries. And a boundary, if you're not familiar with the concept, is simply the idea of what is and is not okay with you. And most of us have boundaries in place already that are very clear. For example, almost no one wishes to be punched in the face and will object if someone attempts to do this. I will object if someone attempts to do this. But there are other boundaries where people do things that we don't like and that we think aren't good for us, but we don't say anything for various reasons. We're afraid they won't like us if we put up the boundary. We're afraid we'll be excluded if we say no to something. Identifying what boundaries you need to have to stay safe, to stay functional, can be incredibly important. And for me, saying no to wonderful, world-saving opportunities is one way to have, or is one important boundary to have. Another important boundary for me was, and a personal one, was to recognize that my own feelings had as much weight as anyone else's. I could still be caring for other people, I could still be kind in my interactions, but I shouldn't suppress how I felt. When I did, I would do stupid things. Another important part of self-care is make the difference between the dark playground and the happy playground. And this is from a brilliant and short set of essays on procrastination. You should read them if you procrastinate. If you don't procrastinate, you should read them. And the author makes the difference between the dark playground and the happy playground as the dark playground being what you do for instant gratification when you're avoiding a stressful task. And the happy playground is what you do in reasonable quantities when you deserve to take some time off and rest. And this is a trap for, I think, many people. It is a trap for me, or many people in tech. My dark playground will be video games. I will play compulsively while avoiding work that I need to do. I did some of that while procrastinating on this presentation because, man, it was stressful at times. However, the difference between the dark playground and the happy playground is immense. When I did do enough work and I went to play my video games, I enjoyed them so much more. Here's another example of the dark playground. If you find yourself being lit from below by this wonderful computer screen at God knows what time in the morning, maybe it's time to stop. And then the last thing, and now I'm almost done, is structure. So there are these standing waves in our lives. And standing waves are things like when you see a rock in a stream and the water flows over it, always in the same ripple. The water is always different, but the pattern remains the same. Well, we have these things in our lives that are caused by our obligations, by our habits, by our workplaces. Change them up when you can. And you can change them by going someplace else to work. If you work at home, even if you work in an office, go to a coffee shop. It'll sometimes help jog you out of the state you're in. Make small agreements with yourself about structure. The famous "I'll always take the stairs" approach. You can make this even more effective if you have a friend who helps keep you accountable. We will always take the stairs together. We will meet at a certain time to do a certain thing. Small changes like this cascade. And I could go on, but what I would so strongly recommend is that you immediately get a copy of this fantastic book. It even has a great title for people in the tech industry, Atomic Habits. And who doesn't love atomicity? It is the best collection of strategies for putting healthy habits and routines in place. It's well researched, it's comprehensive, it's, from my own experience, effective. I can't recommend it highly enough. And it helps you take all of these practices that help you avoid burnout and turn them into routine things you do on a daily, weekly, monthly, whatever basis. I'll keep posting resources as I move forward. I'm trying to encourage therapists to help me write blog posts on each of these management strategies. Encourage actually here means pay more precisely, so it has to go at a somewhat reasonable rate since I'm self-funding, but keep an eye on this GitHub repository, and I'll keep adding things to it. And there, that is the end of my deck. I'm sure that I'm out of time. I'm happy to chat if anyone wants